Welcome, everyone, to our webinar event today, High Density, Low Cost, Fast Access, the Advantages of Hybrid Cloud Archives. I'm Bryant Fraser. I'm the editorial director of Studio Daily, and I'm happy to be here. I think this is actually a fairly timely event, especially if you were at NAB last week. You probably heard a lot about hybrid cloud from a lot of different directions, and maybe kind of a whirlwind at this point, trying to figure out what it all means and specifically how it might apply to your own business and the efficiencies that you need to chase after as they relate to your specific workflow. So our hope today is we can isolate and explain a specific example of how a hybrid cloud workflow is making a big difference in the media business, and that can help clarify your own thinking on the subject. So first, I'd like to thank our sponsor, Cloudian, for making this discussion possible. And also, I'd like to thank Shane Miner of WGBH, which is a Cloudian customer, for agreeing to come in and take the time to explain it all for us. And of course, thank you, everyone in the room attending to this webinar, for coming, making this an interactive event. I know if you're working in media these days, the odds are that you're very busy, so we really do appreciate that you've carved out a chunk of your schedule today to join us on the webinar. You can help us make this a more interactive event as the presentations proceed. You can type your questions in the Q&A panel you'll see on screen. We'll collect those as we go along and dedicate some time at the end of the program to answering audience questions. If you have a technical problem or a question about the webinar interface itself, you can also type those questions in, and we'll do our best to answer those in real time as they come in so that you get the most out of the live event. Speaking of the live event, if you're looking to revisit it later, there are two ways you can do that. If you want the slide presentation for reference, that's going to be available for download. You can find a PDF download under the Event Resources tab on your screen. I believe that's near the bottom of the left-hand column. There's a drop-down menu you can click, select a PDF of the slides, and it will allow you to download that to your desktop. And finally, if you have to step out early, get called away from your computer, do not worry. You can watch a replay of the full presentation later. Just come back to the same URL you used to access the webinar room today. And as long as you're registered, you will be kicked in to watch a replay. So I think we're all set on those little housekeeping fronts. We'll move forward. I'm going to introduce our presenters. We have two speakers today. First up is going to be Shane Miner. Shane is Senior Director of Technical Services at WGBH in Boston. And if you watch public television at all, I think you know WGBH. My understanding is they produce more than 50% of all PBS programming. I think Shane's been there since 2014, so he's going to talk to you today about the hybrid cloud archive that they've implemented that makes it possible for them to keep up with a really rapid pace of production, ingest, media retrieval, and data protection. I think his presentation is going to help you get inside his thinking and reasoning, and it'll make the advantages of the hybrid approach for them clear, especially in relation to the workflow they had in place previously. After that discussion, Shane's going to hand the keys to Cloudian's CMO, Jon Toor. Jon has a long history in our industry with a deep background in enterprise storage, data centers, virtualization, and more. So he really understands the needs of media customers in the 21st century, the benefits of object storage, and the hybrid cloud structure. I actually met him for the first time at NAB last week, where he was in the Cloudian booth sort of evangelizing hybrid cloud for media customers. So he'll talk a little more specifically about what Cloudian does and where it fits in the bigger picture of a hybrid cloud workflow. Again, let me encourage you one more time just to ask questions as they occur to you by typing them into the question panel. Gives us an idea of what you get out of the presentation, and of course, you will get more out of it as we get a chance to address any specific comments or concerns that you do have. We'll get to as many of them as we can at the close of our program today. With that, I think I should stop talking, and we should get into the meat of the session. So I'm going to welcome Shane Miner from WGBH to the virtual stage here. Take it away, Shane.
Thank you very much. So as expressed, I'm Shane Miner, and I'm at WGBH. I've been here for coming up on 5 years now. And for those of you who aren't familiar with WGBH, we are a public television and radio station in the Boston market. So one part of my job is supporting the broadcast infrastructure as we serve like the Boston local market, but we do have a large national content production arm, and so some of the brands that you may be familiar with would be American Experience, Masterpiece, Nova, Antiques Roadshow, and Frontline. Those are kind of our big national brands. We do have a local news team, and we do news for both television and radio. And I manage the team that oversees sort of all of the technology, the things that you'd think of as traditional IT, but then as the broadcast and IT worlds merge, a lot of the technology infrastructure that underpins all of that. And we are large by a public media standards, so we're about 1,000 full-time employees here in Boston. So we're large in terms of the scale of public media, but that doesn't make us large in terms of a lot of enterprise. And specifically, I'll talk about kind of our archive workflow. So our archives team has been archiving the content at WGBH for a long time. WGBH has been around for about 65 years, and so that takes us back. We have the original Julia Child film reels that sit in our archive today. So there's a lot of content that they oversee in that. Our job was to sort of help them reinvent the technology that underpins that. So our previous workflow, we had sort of a complicated workflow in terms of both internal and external producers. A lot of those national productions do work with external producers, so an independent contracted production shop would produce an episode or a couple of episodes for us, or internal producers who are creating media. All of them would deliver either hard drives or tapes into the kind of our ingest flow. That would be ingested into our edit suites in order to be finished. An external producer might actually do the finishing for us, and so then their tapes or their hard drives would go directly to our archive prep team. But after finishing, for any of the content we finished internally or the external content we finish, that ends up being organized by our archive team. They are taking all those hard drives, curating all of the content on the hard drives, and then delivering them to 2 LTO tapes. One they store off-site and one they store on-site. And so those 2 LTO copies were our previous method for archiving digital media. One of the caveats was that in order to archive appropriately, we have to add a significant amount of metadata. And the way we did that was we delivered a FileMaker database to internal and external parties. They would complete the FileMaker database, which had lots of descriptive metadata around all of the media that they were delivering to us. And then that archives team is the team that tries to marry that together, curates that metadata, make sure it's appropriate, et cetera, and then kind of finalize it, right? So it would sort of get the stamp of approval in order to be put into our vault to be finally stored. That presented a number of challenges, right? So because of the nature of sort of storing on an LTO tape, requests can be time consuming. It can take 24 to 72 hours for media to be delivered. They go into the vault once a day in the afternoon, and if your request came in Friday after that time, it'd be ordinary for that to be returned on Monday. They can process faster requests occasionally, but it's a real challenge, right? Because you're talking about pulling an LTO tape off a shelf, putting into a drive, reading the files off of that drive, and then delivering them back to the user requesting them. And we struggle to keep up, right? That flow is very linear. So as the media arrives, the team needs to process it, put it into the vault in order to free up more, both people time and, storage resources to continue to process that. We see, I think, like everybody in the media industry, a significant increase in the amount of media that a show produces to produce the show. The cost of filming a lot has decreased to the point where shows are filming a lot more. And so all that raw material needs to get processed. All that raw material needs to be dealt with by the archives team. And so that makes it a real challenge to keep up with the sort of huge flow of data that's coming at them. It has its physical limitations. So it's a pretty manual process. Right now, fill out that FileMaker by hand. You hand it off to the team. The hard drive, the LTO tapes are all stored in a physical room, and so they're pulled out and physically managed. We did see that media ended up everywhere. So because sometimes it could be time-consuming, 24 to 48 hours, or 72 hours to get a piece of media back, some news-oriented teams in particular would try to kind of keep a copy for themselves. So we'd end up with an external hard drive under a producer's desk. I think it's a pretty common media story. which is just that in order to feel like I still had a quick and easy access to the media, I just keep myself a copy even though the archives team is taking care of it. And that's an inefficiency in our organization. And I didn't love the DR idea that what we were doing is storing one LTO tape in our building and then another LTO tape off-site, but still in the Northeast, right? So still sort of regional to us. And search was difficult. So what we found as we sort of did the discovery around how people were using the archives, it's possible to find older media, and definitely our shows in particular, because of their sort of documentary style, take huge advantage of our archives. But it's not incredibly simple to find things. It's not incredibly simple to screen things. You end up with a request for a lot of media. They have to deliver a lot of media, which is more time consuming. It's not like you're able to view proxies early on and decide if this media is worth retrieving or not. You're sort of just deciding from the described metadata if there's value there. To the degree where we actually had productions reporting that they would sometimes rebuy footage or reshoot footage because it was, just easier if someone was in the field to grab that than it was to see about what was available in the archives. Right? They couldn't have visibility into it right away, which made them think it'll be easier if we just kind of reshoot that. And that's an organizational inefficiency. It drives the cost of our productions up. So as we work through with the archives team and with those production units, what our model should be, what our kind of new solution objectives would be, we really wanted to accelerate workflows, right? So we wanted media retrieval to be visible right away, and we wanted minutes, not days, for media to be delivered back to the edit suite. We needed better search. We really wanted to expand search in a huge way. One of our core goals is really eliminating dependence on the MAM. So my team feels pretty strongly that it's oftentimes the media asset management system that locks you in from a vendor perspective and really controls a lot of your workflow. And we really wanted to eliminate that. That was a really high priority for us, and that it takes a couple phases. I'll talk more about that, but that was a real driver for us. We wanted realistic, achievable DR, so we wanted a simple way to manage that DR. It can be challenging if we're going to try to manage 2 or 3 data centers across the country. That is a real difficult thing for my team. We don't have a huge team. And the costs around that we had to weigh against the costs of a cloud service, either public or private. And we wanted to create a platform for the future, right? So we wanted to plan around our technology and around our future implementation so that we could live with this, and then it would be something that would really, fundamentally drive our business in terms of letting us make more media, right? That's our end goal, is helping our media makers make more media. And we wanted to make sure we were doing that as part of that archive solution. So we did look at a number of alternatives. We looked at just an internal NAS or SAN. We do have some of that storage internally. It's just not where we're going with our archive. We did feel like there's some limitations. It is more expensive, and the scalability is a challenge. So we do have a huge amount of media, and every time we mention storage, producers just want more and more and more and more. And then we were relatively sure that we would want some sort of hybrid model. We were going to use ourselves and someone else to do a kind of second version. And all the NAS SAN options require some level of software integration, right? It's not a sort of out of the box. It's an extra tool, or it's an extra step. It's an extra thing you're monitoring to make sure you were looking at it to make sure it would work. We did look at cloud storage only, and that presented some really powerful tools, right? The scalability is amazing. And it's pretty cost effective for infrequent data pull. We were looking at a pretty heavy data pull, so that was a factor for us. And sometimes media workflow is a little bit tough if you're going to move media back and forth between the cloud, unless you have, direct connection or at least really, really huge pipes. And then the costs around the sort of repeated pulls can be a challenge. And so some of that math didn't look great to us. And was a little bit challenging. Also, as we looked at Cloud Direct, we were looking at S3 or that style of storage, so really highly available storage, and the costs around that are higher than some of those kind of alternative deeper storages or infrequent access storages. And the last, we did look at object store, right? We really liked that we were building sort of scalable, similar to the cloud. Obviously, we have the challenge that the boxes are here, and we have to add boxes if we need to. But there are some ways that we can fake having boxes here and still have that sort of expandable storage. One of the really important features for us was the embedded metadata. So the object itself holds metadata. I'll talk more about that, but that was really key to us from getting the MAM out of the way, from feeling like we weren't beholden to the MAM. We liked that the object storage solutions could include an S3 API option, so that any sort of integration we did to an on-prem S3 API, we could also use with Amazon S3 API, and that was a relatively easy lift. So all of our development time was really effective in both spaces, and object storage was really cost effective for us. Definitely we ran into it a little bit early in its infrastructure development, right? So it's not as common and popular as you see places. There, vendors like our common vendors like Avid and Premier aren't as comfortable reading and writing to object store, so you need some, intermediaries or gateways, or so some ways to solve some of those problems. And that's, you just have to remember that as you sort of get ready. I've talked about this a little, but the anatomy of an object. What was really compelling for us with the idea of an object is that you have the media, but you also have metadata about the media directly attached to it. So you take the storage and you turn it into a database about the media itself. And that was a really powerful thing for us, because it lets us do some things with different applications looking at the same storage, understanding the metadata, and being able to take action accordingly or to present visibility accordingly. And it really got us out of needing a MAM to take care of all of those problems for us. And that was really sort of essential for us, is actually the object itself holds metadata inherently. So this is our current our initial implementation. So we did 3 petabytes right now. It took up 15 rack units of height. That was 90% less than the LTO library we had to store a similar amount, actually a lesser amount of content. So we saved a huge amount of physical space. We were able to real-time replicate to Amazon, so we're able to just turn on a bucket policy that replicates our data from the bucket here to the bucket in Amazon, and then use Amazon's infrequent access and Glacier, and now their Deep Glacier, as the place where we're keeping that second piece of data, right? We don't need any extra software. We just turn on a policy on the bucket and it can take care of it, and we're only paying for Glacier-style costs at Amazon. We're also rarely retrieving, because in general we have the copy and it's available here locally, so it's only in a problem scenario on site when we actually have to do a retrieve from Amazon. We can, where we need, do this capacity tiering, so the ability to say, I'm going to push this bucket to S3, and I'm really going to only hold 1/10 of it locally, and it's just going to be the 1/10 that is used by, by the client or by, our internal customers. And that lets us quickly add capacity without actually having to add physical storage in the building. We do have relatively good connectivity to Amazon, so we get pretty good high-speed stuff there, and that was important to being able to do that well, but it does make it so that we don't have to always add another rack of gear in our shop in order to sort of appear to be expanding capacity internally. That tiering concept was really important to us. So here is what our new workflow world looks like. So currently external internal producers can bring all of the media and the metadata into an initial ingest. And that ingest media and metadata ends up on Cloudian. Then everyone can look at and pull from Cloudian appropriately. So the edit can pull that media from Cloudian, can work on that media at the same time that the archives is curating the media or looking at the media and the metadata. It removes the linear flow that used to exist and really lets multiple people do the same thing at the same time. We can use AWS as our Glacier DR, and we can use AWS as S3 for sort of expansion growth, rapid ability to scale. We also are close partners with Sony, and we use a lot of Sony C, which is their cloud-based platform, and we still use that extensively. We just use that largely for like final shows and for collaboration with producers in process. It's not where our final archive lives. It's where we do either work in progress or sales of media. And so definitely one of the huge factors for us was improving search, right? So it is true that we actually have an archive that looks like the picture on the left. We have a series of things with stickers on them, and people go in and check them out. And we're closer and closer to having this sort of real-time, metadata-centric, object-oriented flow. And that's really compelling for us, right? It really makes the archives team, when they're adding metadata, or the edit team when they're adding metadata, all of them are gaining value from that. And it used to be a little bit more linear, so that when it got to the end, it had value. But it was tough to sort of garner that value earlier in the process. So we really think about this, and this is, I think, specifically around the MAM. We really try hard to think about not a single monolithic application, but a series of microservices. We think this improves our nimbleness and makes us really flexible and reduces cost. And this is at the heart of the MAM. So what we wanted was a small, lightweight MAM that would allow visibility to Cloudian as a storage engine, but would also not need to be the only way to view those things. We use a lot of Vantage for transcoding. We want it to be able to understand what's going on there. We're pushing a lot to S3 for our websites, and we want to be able to use services that perform those functions, but that don't have to always alert the MAM to all of that action, or where the MAM doesn't have to be the driver for all of that action. And by basically disassociating, by making the service, the service of storage is now also a service for some at least minimal amount of metadata. It really removes you from being beholden to kind of any particular vendor. When someone says, oh, we're going to do it this way, we can say, oh, no, that's okay, we can do it this way or another way, right? And we're able to switch microservices whenever we want based on cost and availability and speed and a whole series of other pieces and parts. This was the real huge one on the search side, is by adding that metadata attached early through an interface, we now make it so that as soon as producers are adding metadata, that's searchable, right? Instead of waiting for it to reach the end of the pipeline for archives to finish, approving that metadata and then making that available to search for producers, we're now able to search sort of as the media comes into our shop. And that's a huge change. It literally can mean months until media becomes searchable at our shop. So, it could be that the edit's done, the show's premiered, but the metadata is still not searchable on the raw media for months. And we do have a stock sales department, and we do secondary sales, and so some of that is potentially lost revenue for us. And so we really are excited about the ability to accelerate a lot of what that looks like and how it works. And I think we're seeing some value there. It's a big deal for us. So I do think, looking back, it's been over a year now. I do think we've significantly improved a lot of that workflow. So adding search throughout has been a huge deal. Our ability to turn more quickly on media requests, I think, will be enormous. And just the compressed workflow, right? So that now groups are working in parallel instead of handing it off from one to the next. All those have been, real positives for us. The space savings is a big deal. We have yet to actually kick out the SL8500 that's sitting in there, but I think it'll be in the next couple months, and we'll finally get to decommission that thing and throw it out, and that's really exciting for me. The what's next, I think last MEB, we heard a lot about AI, and I think we'll continue to. We've definitely started to experiment with some of this. So because we're planning to store, or we're storing the chunks of that media on Amazon, it's already in a place where using, Amazon's recognition or transcription services is really easy. And all we have to do is return, simple results. So the data out is actually really minimal. But we can get a lot of value add around the automated metadata, right? So recognition is super powerful. It can identify all kinds of things. We haven't done as much with recognition yet. We've done a lot with transcription. So we're transcribing a lot of the audio that we receive, and we're taking that and turning that into either caption style files to make the media searchable for ourselves, or to take keywords, take just particular words that show up a lot in a transcription and try to add that to search. And that's been really valuable, right? That we think is an area for a lot of growth. Our news team, as an example, does a lot of audio interviews, and then their audio interviews they want transcribed. So those kinds of services, I think, are going to be really valuable for us, right? So what's next? We did initially we scoped 1 petabyte. That quickly became not feasible. We very quickly moved up to 3 petabytes, and we're actually, I think, already at 4.5, just out of the necessity of. It was amazing how much media showed up from everywhere, right? All of a sudden, everyone was like, "Oh, I've got 75 hard drives sitting here, and we'd love to put that somewhere." Our media library and archives team said, "Hey, we were looking for a grant to digitize a significant portion of the of our archive, that's going to cost, or that's going to be, 3 additional petabytes. Is that okay with you? And from our perspective, it was great. Like, let's get all the media in one place. Let's have a single place for all of this stuff so that we can make sure that we're adding as much value to it, using that metadata as much as we can. And as a mission-driven organization, it is sort of in our mission to try to preserve this for the public good. So in terms of lessons learned, looking back on it, definitely it was a project that took me about 3.5, 4 years to get off the ground. It was tough to get all of our internal shareholders on the same page and, sort of with the same talking points. But once we did, it was amazing how quickly we saw value, or people saw value in that. We did run into some problems with teams that weren't as excited about change. I think that can be true at any organization. But we found some quick wins. So the first early use case we had was Frontline had just finished a show and was about to start another show. They needed storage space in their edit suite as quickly as possible to do that show, but the archives team wasn't ready to take at the time it was only 60 terabytes, but they needed to move 60 terabytes out of the edit suite, and the archives team wasn't ready to take it yet. They had a storage backlog. So we said, we've got Cloudian stood up, just move it all over here. We'll leave it here, and archives can take it whenever they're ready. Frontline was able to deliver that, to push that over to the Cloudian and clean up their edit space, so that very quickly they were able to kind of start the next edit, start the edit for the next show. And that convinced a lot of people that we were on the right path. All of a sudden, Frontline was a vocal proponent of, this has been great and really is something we need to help push for. How do we get everybody on board, and how do we kind of keep moving with all of these efforts? And that was a big deal. And definitely there was a lot of operational efficiencies that were available, right? So knowing the workflow of your media was critical for us to be able to help streamline the entire process. Understanding what a workflow would look like with external producers, understanding what internal producers are doing, all of those workflows have a lot of opportunity once you have all of the media in the same place for a lot of operational gains. But it does take just knowing those plans and being ready to kind of execute them. So I think that's it for me. So let me turn it over to Jon. Obviously, Cloudian was the vendor we selected for that object store internally, but let me turn it over to Jon to tell you more about Cloudian.
Oh, thank you very much, Shane. That was terrific. And yeah, I think that your points are really on, really, really accurate, and something we heard over and over again at NAB last week was the challenges that producers are facing in terms of dealing with the large amounts of media that are being created today. Not only are creating media faster through 4K and 8K resolutions, but also are retaining it longer. Keeping more of that media on hand so you can continue to monetize it. And that's exactly the challenges that this system from Cloudian was built to address. It is a on-prem storage system. So it sits in your data center. I think you already mentioned that it takes up a fraction of the space of the tape library that you're replacing. And it's built to be easily scaled. So that's the other key part of this, is obviously you need to think ahead. You're going to be acquiring more media over time. So it's a modular system that is very cost effective, less cost than public cloud, and can be scaled continuously to reach capacities up to an exabyte. All within your data center, all managed by a small team in a single namespace, so it stays simple as it grows. The other thing about this is it's S3 compatible. So why S3? Well, it is the language of the cloud. It's the most common API found in the cloud. And that means that not only is it compatible with many of the applications you have, which are built to, say, store data to the cloud. Now you can store them on-prem as well. But also it gives you that hybrid cloud capability that you mentioned in your talk. When you store something to your Cloudian in your data center there in Boston, it's automatically being replicated to the cloud. And that means you're protecting that, you're getting that DR function essentially for zero additional workload. And you mentioned your stories around tape. We're making 2 copies. That's certainly something we heard over and over again last week was tape handling is a challenge. It just takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of attention to make sure it gets done correctly. It's certainly doable, but gosh, wouldn't it be easier if you could just push a button, store to your on-prem storage, and have it automatically go out to the cloud? And that's exactly what Cloudian accomplishes. So one question that people sometimes ask is, how does this compare with other types of storage, and where does this fit in the landscape? Because it is a fairly new thing. On-prem object storage is a new player in the storage landscape. So, where does it fit? Well, we think of it this way. The conventional storage types that you mentioned, SAN and NAS, were really designed for performance. If you think about systems like Pure, NetApp, Isilon, they were designed with performance in mind, not necessarily designed for easy scaling. So if you think about what your requirements are for archive, you need it to grow, you need it to be cost effective, you need it to be easy to manage as it grows very, very large. And that's really where Cloudian fits in. We think of it as capacity data as opposed to fast data. But if you look at what's in your landscape, that capacity data is actually 80% of what you have on hand. So it's all that stuff which is currently sitting in your tape library. It's all those hard drives sitting underneath producers' desks, that you mentioned. Those are a classic use case of removable hard drives, tapes sitting around the facility. That all adds up, and it's an enormous amount of information out there, and as I said, typically about 80%. So that's really the use case we were designed for, is that scalable data. And in the larger scheme of things, this fits into a lot of different environments. In addition to media active archives, it's also a great repository for backup data, coming off of data protection systems, or for video surveillance systems, or for AI machine learning, where you're generating data that's being used as a learning data set. All of these things are classic examples of capacity data. Pretty much if you're thinking of putting it on tape, or you're thinking of putting it on any kind of removable media, or just as something that needs to be less frequently accessed, it's a great candidate for what Cloudian does. One thing you mentioned in your talk, Shane, was this is an archival device that sits in the middle of the workflow. And I think what I really like about your before and after workflows, in your before workflow, the archive sat at the end. And I think you mentioned it took, in some cases, several months for data to work its way through the process and end up in that archive. Well, in your after process, this is a device that sits in the middle of the workflow, so actually the ingest goes very quickly into that environment, which means two things. First of all, it means it's being immediately protected, right? Because as soon as you put it into that archival system, you've now got it protected in your DR workflow, as opposed to having that happen somewhere down the path. So very critically, you're protecting that data earlier. The second thing is that now you've got one single repository where that data can be accessed by all the different parts of your workflow, from editing media to managing media to ultimately searching and visualizing it and then distributing it. You've now got one repository where it can be accessed for all those different pieces of the work you're trying to get done. And that means that all of them can be working on a piece of media in a similar way. So, for example, if you wanted to update metadata, say you're doing some updating of metadata in your edit process, maybe you're doing some other kind of updating to metadata in the cloud. I think you mentioned Microsoft. You can now do that in a single place, which means that everyone can be enhancing that metadata, enhancing the media, all in a single location, so they're all working from the same copy. Or, of course, you can have multiple copies in one location, but you have that flexibility to have everyone accessing a single system. Well, what that means is now you've made it much easier to search things, you've made it a lot easier to add value to that media, and you've made it a lot easier for everyone to get their work done quickly, because you're not, the mechanical, physical handoffs are now gone. You've also given yourself independence of your MAM. Of course, you may still want a MAM as part of your workflow, but you've also got another way of finding media, which is that metadata that's built in that gives you another means of using a Google-like search. to find media, wherever it may be. And that's true whether it's in your on-prem repository for Cloudian or you've replicated it to the cloud. Either way, you can use that metadata to go search that environment and immediately find the media you're looking for and save yourself time, monetize it faster, and as you mentioned, prevent that possibility of having to rebuy media that you already have, which it's got to be awkward. So the beauty of this is that it fits in with the applications that that you and others already have in their environment. So whether you're dealing with an S3 object connection to that software, or you're dealing with a file connection in the case of Adobe Premiere, of course, is file-based. We can connect to that as well. So either way, you can connect to that application and store that data to the object store in the form of an object, which can then be replicated to the cloud for DR purposes. So it works with the applications you have. It works with the S3 compatible applications as well as file. And finally, it costs 70% less than traditional enterprise storage. So you can think of it as, this is storage for 80% of your media that costs, 70% less than what you're paying right now for enterprise storage. And what that means is that you've now got a scalable solution that's going to save you money versus other types of on-prem storage. It's also going to save you money versus even cloud storage, which means it's a great economy for your environment overall. So with that, I thank you very much, and I'll turn it back over to Bryant to take us home.
All right. Well, I think we're gonna go home by way of a little bit of a Q&A session here. So I'd like to once again encourage people in the audience who've been kind of rolling this over in their heads. If there's anything you're not clear on, something you're wondering about, how it works now or what's going to happen in the future, feel free to go ahead and type those into the Q&A panel on your screen, and we'll try and go through and get to as many of those as we can here at the end of our program. But I'm going to start off. I did have a question, and it was interesting, Shane, when you started talking. You're talking about WGBH and how much programming goes through you guys for PBS, and it sounds like a pretty big operation for pretty big broadcast operation. But then you said as enterprise storage goes, it's actually not in the grand scheme of things. It's not a huge operation. But it did make me wonder, and maybe this is a question more for Jon at Cloudian. What is the range, or what's the diversity of broadcasting and post-production facilities that can benefit from this kind of hybrid workflow? Does it scale down to like maybe a boutique studio that really does have petabytes of storage in their archive? Can they get a lot out of it, or is it more for the big TV stations and places like that? Just like I said, diversity. I'm kind of trying to get a sense of what the range is of customers that can take advantage of this and save money and get more efficiency.
Yeah, exactly. So in terms of the range of folks that can take advantage of this, really it all depends on your media requirements, because there are some folks that are relatively small shops, but maybe they're shooting a lot of 4K or just handling a lot of 4K media, like say an FX house that maybe isn't creating a lot of media on their own, but is handling a tremendous amount of it. We start at around 100 terabytes of capacity, and the reason for that is this is a modular system, and the data protection is actually built in, so we are striping data across multiple modules. So consequently, it starts at around 100 terabytes, and then it scales up from there in a very granular way. You can add capacity, in a relatively small chunk at a time. But it really is entirely dependent on the volume of data you're working with as opposed to the type. So it could fit into production, post-production, FX houses, distribution, over the top, media consolidators, a wide variety of environments.
Okay, and then you did mention that whether you're working in 4K or 8K might have something to do with it. I was wondering from Shane, over there at WGBH, do you have a lot of 4K and/or 8K media in your custody, or are you
So we
still
do
mainly HD?
Yeah, no, I mean, I would say like most of our output is HD, and that's because most of our output's meant for PBS broadcast air, where HD is still the flavor of choice. We do shoot, so we did a documentary called Rare recently, and that was shot all in 4K. We have a number of episodes and documentaries we're doing in 4K. It's not the majority of content yet, and they're starting some 8K experiments. We have the problem that it's all documentary, right? So it's a ridiculous amount of footage for every minute of screen time.
Right.
But yeah, no, we're in the 4K space. I would say 20%, and we'll be only more and more of that as we go. I think that's sort of everyone's expectation, right?
And if you're acquiring material in 4K, then you probably want to archive it in 4K, right? Rather than just archiving a 2K master or a 2K version.
No, 100%. Definitely, maintaining the original quality of the media is huge from a resale perspective, right? Everything that we can get in HD now has a huge amount of value. The SD stuff that we have to up-res is a little bit less valuable, right? So it's huge for us to be able to keep those high-quality originals. Our producers really expect it.
Right, and that's something that you did mention in passing with stock sales. So with a system like this, monetization is a big part of it, because if you can find your media more easily, then you can actually leverage it and reuse it and maybe get some revenue out of it more easily too.
That's the idea.
Let's see. We had a question from someone in the audience who was wondering, when you're talking about ingest and the importance of metadata, they were just curious, how does adding the metadata typically work? I mean, what's the best practice you've found? Are people I guess I don't need to ask a more specific question than that. Just how do you ensure that you are gathering adequate and accurate metadata at the point of ingest, so that all these benefits that accrue further down the line are actually real and not just imaginary because you have bad data?
No, for sure. So we are using a MAM, but one of our MAM requirements was that that we can actually in the MAM select which metadata we want written to the object itself, so that they're writing that metadata to the object. We use Sony's Navigator X. That's the product we happen to select, but most MAMs will talk with the S3 API. The unique ask we had to have was an altered endpoint, so not AWS S3, but instead our local S3. And we wanted to be able to say, we want title, description, and unique identifier to be written to the object itself, so that we can, through other mechanisms, make all of that search and discoverability possible. Then in the MAM itself, there are ways in which we can require fields. A lot of times we base that on workflow, so you can upload anything you want, but you can't share it with other people or send it for distribution until you've filled out a certain number of fields, so that we can validate that we have the rights to the material or something similar to that. And a lot of times that's in that NavX interface as opposed to the Cloudian. That was a choice we made a while ago. I don't know if, John, you want to talk anything about that? I do think you guys are adding some interface stuff around metadata add, but.
Yeah, absolutely. So we provide tools to search metadata, to help enhance metadata. We use third-party tools for this, such as Elasticsearch and Kibana, to assist with editing, visualization, and search. But there's some great tools out there that we take full advantage of.
And Shane, you mentioned as part of your presentation, it sounds like you're starting to experiment with some of the machine learning techniques out there or rather tools, I guess, rather than techniques, but these emerging tools for metadata enrichment, where you can get information about a scene because, the AI recognized the building in the scene, or the AI recognized someone's face in a scene. And that's a huge area of development right now for the media industry. And that's all happening in the cloud. So in order to take advantage of it, you pretty much have to have your media somewhere where these huge AI techniques can run efficiently. So a system like this kind of positions you well for taking advantage of those developments, as I understand it. Would you say that's?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I'd say that's definitely true. Definitely, there are some open source efforts around the same in the world, and like there's cost factoring in each, right? So there are places where Amazon is really far ahead, and we want to take advantage of their tool. IBM Watson's actually doing really great in the transcription space, and so we want to take advantage of their tool sometimes. I think the key for us is by storing a copy locally and a copy in the cloud, we can open source some of our lower value content. Do that really inexpensively, but increase its value somewhat with some basic tools. And then where we know we have high value content and we want to really return a huge, we know we can return a significant investment, we're willing to invest a little bit more in returning more data around those objects. Because of the replication rules, any metadata we discover in either place is going to be written to the object and shared among those spaces. So all of our search gets better regardless of where we do the metadata, like the metadata extraction, I'd call it, for lack of a better word.
Right, and all of this speaks to why it's so important to get started on a project like this, because the sooner you start getting your data off of tape and onto something that is immediately accessible and has that metadata embedded, such as object storage, the sooner you can start taking advantage of those tools and building up the infrastructure that's ultimately going to help you to get a lot more value out of your archive.
Right. Okay, let me go in here to some more of the questions that are coming in. Someone's asking, does Cloudian provide the search tools, or is there another overlay application that provides the search capabilities? So it sounds like there are a few different ways search happens.
Right, exactly. So the way our customers most normally do it is with Elasticsearch and Kibana, which is an open source tool that we provide integration with. So it's pretty much plug and play. It's a very it's similar to Google in your search experience.
Right.
And I would say, like, we added a MAM to that, but we still require the MAM to use Elasticsearch under the hood so that they're sharing search repository around that. And, by doing that, we make sure that, all of these things are synced. If we want to ever use some other way to visualize search, we can do that. And we're not limited in any way, shape, or form. But there was just some value adds to the MAM that we thought were nice. But surely, you could go either way.
Here's a question about metadata. Will the metadata created in the cloud tools also be accessible within your on-site version of the objects?
So the answer for us is definitely yes, right? The flow will be create the metadata, add it to the on-site objects, and let them replicate off to the off-site objects, because the off-site objects are less important to us than the on-site objects. So we want to add the metadata in-house first and then let that pass backwards. But because the objects are moved off-site, that's where we can easily, derive metadata with the AWS services if we want to. We don't have to worry. Transport isn't an extra step in that process. It's just there and available.
Okay. We've got a question about ingest. What tool is used to ingest the content?
Yeah, so for us, it's all over the place. Definitely the NavX, the Media Asset Management System, is one primary way. But we have, we use a lot of Telestream Vantage. Telestream, one of the requests we had for them a while ago was they started supporting AWS's S3, and we just asked that we could also define an endpoint, so define our local Cloudian storage instead of the Amazon version, and they were able to do that in kind of a cycle. And so we do use Vantage for a lot of automated workflow and to move media into and out of Cloudian, into and out of the edit. Those are the kind of two primary tools today, but there's no question that there are some people who use, like the CyberDucks of the world, right? Like the just simple GUIs that let you move, large files to and from.
Sure.
Anything with the S3 API, right? But we have people who are doing that too, right? Who just have kind of a weird offshoot need. They just need a little bit of storage quickly, and it's a fast way we can get them up and running.
And there's a host of ways of doing that, from the ones he mentioned to obviously everts as well, to other MAMs, as well as if you're using NAS as a device for storage, there's tools such as Comprise or even the NetApp and Isilon offer tools to tier data off to object storage. So it's becoming a very easy thing to get data into.
There's also some tools that are very Avid-centric around backing up. Marquee is the company that I think of who will do backups of workspaces or archives of workspaces that can read and write to that Cloudian storage as well.
Right. So to some degree, your choices in this are going to be driven by what what products, what tools are already in your workflow.
Yeah, and what was really compelling for us, I mean, the two primary factors for us in picking Cloudian were price, which was great, and then that S3 API compatibility. So by choosing a vendor who was highly S3 API compatible, anytime a vendor says, well, we can read and write to AWS S3, all we have to ask them to do is one small code change, generally a very small code change, in order to support us using Cloudian internally with all of the same API. So like even our developers internally just use the, AWS's Java SDK or whatever and simply point to the endpoint that resides in our building, and all the same commands work, all the same API stuff works, and that lets us onboard more vendors to using the solution more quickly, and that's one of the really, the big deals for us, what was really important for us in the choice.
And I think we're kind of making a circle around the latest question that came in, which is someone wanted to know, what is the S3 API and why use this? And it sounds like I think you said at one point that S3 is kind of the standard language of the cloud, so it makes sense to support
exactly.
it.
Yeah, exactly. The S3 API, why have something different? And it's like, why do something other than just what we've been using? And the answer is because it is the standard language of the cloud. It was designed for moving data over long distances and moving a lot of it. So as an example, it has features that let you transfer large files and do it in a way which is robust. So if that transfer were to get interrupted halfway through due to a bad connection, it happens all the time. You have a way of restarting without having to start over from the beginning. So it's just a very robust way to move large amounts of data. Also, it is the language that was designed to give you all kinds of advanced management capabilities that come with cloud storage, and now you can get those same kinds of advanced management in your data center as well, because we're using the same language. So it's kind of the next evolution of enterprise storage that just happens to be super well suited for exactly what we're talking about here, which is media workflows.
And I'd add that there's a huge amount of open source development around that S3 API. There's a huge number of tools that address the S3 API because it was such a pioneer and so powerful in terms of sort of standardizing a way to talk about storage from an API perspective. There's a lot of stuff that's available already that you can sort of leverage, and those are big factors for us.
Okay, let me urge folks in the room one more time. If you have questions, now is the time to submit them. We've got a few minutes left and a few questions left in the queue, so please type them in now if you've got them. I am looking at one which is the unavoidable question, maybe one of the first and last questions you face when you're trying to plan something like this for your business. Someone's asking about cost, or I guess specifically about pricing. They want to know, is there an annual fee or is it a one-time cost? I mean, how do companies typically plan around an expenditure like this, and how do they think about what their outlay is going to be and what their ROI is?
Yeah, so from a cost perspective, Cloudian is definitely the lowest cost of type of enterprise storage. So if you need something that's scalable, that's protected, that provides full enterprise management capabilities, it does that at a cost that is less than public cloud. So our pricing comes down to less than 1 penny per gigabyte per month, which if you think of public cloud pricing for something that's being frequently accessed, it's quite a bit less. It is something that sits in your data center, so it is equipment that you would purchase and resides in your data center, as would any other enterprise storage. And as such, there's no ongoing fees other than support costs. So just like buying any other enterprise device, you would typically buy a support contract with it that has a duration. But other than that, no, there's no ongoing fees, there's no egress charges, there's no excess charges. That's part of where the savings come in. Is if you're using the archive, you're using that information, you're going to be accessing it quite a bit. And of course, in the cloud, those fees can really add up. So, It's very cost effective, it's very scalable, and you have the option of then tiering off to the cloud and using that environment for what it's really best suited for, which is offsite DR or for data analysis, not necessarily something where you're just continuously moving data back and forth and racking up access charges. So I hope that answers that, but yeah, it's about a third the cost of other storage types as long as you're dealing with 100 terabytes or more of data.
And I'd just add, we did add an operational cost in our model, and that's because we're DRing to the cloud. So there's there's that monthly cost for that. We did consider two Cloudians, a node here and then a node at some other facility. We would have just had some challenges around paying for the colo, and all of those also have a monthly cost, right? So for us, this made the most sense, but you do the math every other year and the numbers come out differently. So those costs just change so quickly. It's well worth looking at what makes the most sense for you.
Okay, we did get another question that just came in. I think we addressed this at one point, kind of in a glancing way. But the question is this compatible with 4K equipment?
Yeah, absolutely. We're storing 4K raw video on it today. No question. Its file size limits are so enormous compared with just about any other option that even though we're going to do a 8K hour-long interview, all that raw media is going to be just fine from our perspective.
And that's actually one of the attractive features of it is if you do start doing more 4K work or more 8K work, it does scale quickly and cost effectively, so that you can handle those new requirements.
Yeah, that's definitely our perspective.
And what did you say the status of that tape library that you had, Shane? Is that entirely gone now? Have you moved all that to the cloud?
So no, we are in the process of decommissioning our internal tape library, which actually isn't our full archive. We still have a huge physical archive because we have pre-digital material, right? So we have film reels from the original French chef series, right? That's our best example, and that's still on film. So we have the work of digitizing that long before we can get to the place where we can decommission. That will be in existence for I think a long time. We do have a single internal mechanical robot tape library that takes up a huge amount of our central equipment room, and I'm very anxious to get rid of that. That stores a collection of different pieces and parts. They're in the process of being moved over to Cloudian. I think we're 3/4 of the way there. We've got one big project coming up over the next couple of weeks to try to finalize that, and then we get to get rid of that big box, which is, it's 3,500 LTO 4 and 5 tapes. So, it's a huge physical space.
Yeah, that'll be nice to say goodbye to.
Yes.
Yeah, nostalgia aside.
Yes.
One more question about any internal network speed requirements. Do I need to worry about whether I'm wired for copper versus fiber in order to take advantage of a system like this inside my facility?
So, my take is more is better, right? And that's largely because what's nice about object store is that as you scale up the number of nodes, you actually scale up the speed of the storage. So it, from our perspective, it's actually very fast storage. It doesn't. Most of those fast storage workflows aren't built that way yet. But I don't think there's a long time before that'll be the case. But it is true. You could. I'm sure you could do it with copper. I'd probably recommend you do it with fiber. But the advantage is that it's all fiber internal to your facility, right? So you're just talking about your core routers being connected to the storage itself in order to facilitate fast I/O to that object itself. I think you just want to plan for that future where you're moving a huge amount of data all the time, right? So get it to fiber and get it there quickly. You're probably going to need it long term anyway.
Right, but we support either one out of the box, so either copper or fiber will work just fine.
All right. Well, coincidentally, I think we are out of fresh questions, and we are at the top of the hour. So it's about time to wrap things up. But boy, I I learned a lot, and I thought that was a really great presentation, guys. So thanks very much for doing such a good job of drawing up and spelling out what goes into this workflow and what went into the decision at WGBH to get there.
Thank you. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
I want to remind everyone in the room that you should be able to download the slideshow if you want to visit it later. Just grab it right now under the Event Resources tab. And if you want to watch the entire presentation again or catch a bit of it that you missed, you can just come into the same URL that you used to hit the live webinar. And I believe you might be able to get that presentation during the replay as well. So, I mean, check that out if you're listening to this on a later date. But once again, thank you very much, Shane. Thank you very much, Jon. Had a great time. Thanks, everyone, for coming today.